Time now for Night Court. With more Americans getting the COVID-19 vaccine, the nation's labor unions are finding themselves in a unique position, defending employees who don't want to get vaccinated. It all comes after the CEO of United Airlines says he wants to require all 60,000 of his company's employees to get inoculated. So, is it legal for your employer to put your job on the line if you choose not to get vaccinated? Let's bring in our legal eagles to debate. Civil rights attorney Robert Patillo and criminal defense attorney Brian Claypool. Welcome both you back, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon.
Okay, let's start with Exhibit A. This is the United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby, part of a town hall, said, "I recognize it's controversial. I think the right thing to do is for United Airlines and for other companies to require the vaccines and to make them mandatory." Robert.
Well, at the end of the day, ultimately, this is a medical decision that should be left between an individual and their doctor. I don't think your employer should step in to give you medical advice or mandate you have a medical procedure, because you put yourself on a slippery slope to what other medical procedures can your employer require, and not to mention the liability factor, that if there's a negative reaction to the vaccine or God forbid someone passes away as a result of such, then the employer will be on the hook for damages for forcing them to take that vaccine. So I think it's an overall terrible policy in terms of both liberty and also from a liability standpoint.
That is a good point. Okay, so to Exhibit B, this is The Hill quoting Kim Cordova, Vice President of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, yesterday saying this: if the employer wants to make that mandatory, they would have to negotiate that with us. They could not change a condition of employment. They could not make that mandatory in the middle of a contract unless the state or the government required it. Brian.
Yeah, Shannon, this really boils down to whether this is a private employer like United Airlines is, or if it's a state-run business. For example, like if you worked for the government, you worked at the county courthouse. Now, here with United or any other private company, they can, in my opinion, require employees to get vaccinated, to get a COVID-19 vaccine, because they are a private employer, and you don't have, as an employee, a constitutional right to fight that. You can't argue that you're deprived of due process because it's a private employer. And think about United, Shannon. They were just on national news because they let a passenger get on the plane without adequately vetting, and they're probably going to get sued because of that. They've got a lot of potential liability, and employers all across the country have potential liability. So if they are a private employer, they should have a right to say, you want to come to work, you better get a COVID-19 vaccine.
Okay, so that takes us to Exhibit C. The OC Register is quoting Alex Volberding of the LA-based law firm Liebert, Cassidy and Whitmore, saying this: being required to take a vaccine likely qualifies as a term or condition of employment. The legal issue here is whether collective bargaining laws allow the employer to make the decision to require that employees receive the vaccine without having to bargain over the decision with the unions that represent the employees. And Robert, so many of these larger employee groups are part of a union. How does that enter into this collective bargaining conversation, into whether they can change the term of someone's employment?
Well, I think that's why it's so important to have collectively bargained rights, and for unions to have a revitalization in America, because this is exactly what they are for, to protect you from overbearing and overstrength by your employer. So, of course, unions should be able to step in, and if any company does, for the good of the company, want to make changes to the rights and responsibilities and conditions of employment, then that should be a collectively bargained right that each employee has an opportunity to vote on. It cannot simply be management saying we're going to mandate a medical procedure for you to maintain employment.
Well, and we're hearing more anecdotal evidence and documented evidence coming forward about adverse reactions to the different vaccines upon the first or second dose. So where does that take us, Brian, then, with employees who would say, I don't feel like we've had enough of a lifeline or a timeline to know exactly what's going to happen with these shots? I'm hearing these stories. I think if I've got a 98, 99% chance of recovering from this particular illness, that I would make an assessment that the vaccine was more harmful to me than the risk of the virus itself.
Yeah, I mean, really what this boils down to again, Shannon, is does the employee have a right to challenge, for example, a private employer and say, hey, look, I don't want to take that vaccine because there's a 1% chance of me having an adverse reaction. This is a public safety risk. And private employers have, in my opinion, an unfettered right to require you, if you're going to walk into their building, to get this COVID-19 vaccine. If you're a public employer, then that employee is going to have a better argument, Shannon. They can argue that their due process rights are violated. So that's what it's going to boil down to.
Well, I would imagine this lawsuit, if it's not already been filed, is coming. So we'll see. Robert and Brian, thanks for lending us your expertise in the meantime.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon.